Our conversation today will focus on how best to advance religious freedom in public schools, which includes countering Christian nationalism in public schools. And we have two outstanding experts in their fields to help us make sense of the current landscape as we think about our responsibilities at Christians Against Christian Nationalism to help ensure religious freedom for all of our public school students, teachers, and staff. Our first speaker today is Maggie Siddiqi. Maggie Siddiqi joined the U.S. Department of Education in May 2022 as its director of the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Prior to joining the Biden-Harris administration, Siddiqi served as senior director of the Religion and Faith team at the Center for American Progress. Prior to that, she spent nearly a decade in national organizations serving American Muslim communities, with a focus on interfaith relations and faith-based advocacy. She has a master's degree in Islam and Christian Muslim relations from Hartford Seminary and a bachelor's degree in religion from Wesleyan University. Siddiqi also earned graduate certificates in Islamic chaplaincy from Hartford Seminary and in nonprofit management from Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. Following Maggie's presentation, you will hear from Brian Kaylor. The Reverend Dr. Brian Kaylor is a Baptist minister with a PhD in political communication and is president and editor-in-chief of Word&Way. He is also the Associate Director of ChurchNet, an organization that serves churches by fostering collaboration and hope for engaging new generations in culture. A former public university professor, he is the author of 4 books on religion, politics, and communication. He writes regularly about faith and culture at the award-winning e-newsletter, A Public Witness. And particularly relevant to today's conversation, he is a regular advocate at the Missouri legislature, testifying in support of religious freedom, including in the public school context. And so now I will invite Maggie Siddiqi to present to our group today. We're so pleased to have you here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you so much to BJC for having me and for hosting this truly important conversation. And thank you everyone today who's participating for your interest in this topic. By way of background, our Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships is located within the Office of the U.S. Secretary of Education, a move that happened within the Biden-Harris administration. Just so you know kind of how we are situated, there are 9 centers for faith-based and neighborhood partnerships across the administration. Another 4 agencies don't have official centers, but also have staff assigned to those partnerships. And together we constitute a sort of interagency cohort working holistically on our collective mission to partner with and to support faith-based and community-based nonprofits in serving the common good. It's our executive order, but I'm going to skip forward a little bit. So at the department, we have 3 main focus areas. I'm going to talk about sort of that middle focus area here. Our body of work on religious freedom is truly essential because America's students are of all faiths and none. All of us should be committed to ensuring that students' learning environments are safe, inclusive, welcoming of all students, and that our policies, our practices, our public voice are aligned in advocating for this fundamental freedom of religion so that all are free to learn. There are a number of ways to kind of slice and dice our work on religious freedom, but I'm going to talk about 3 sort of dimensions of this work today. First, the freedom to worship without fear. Second, our First Amendment protections. And third, religious literacy. So freedom to worship without fear. So many of you may be wondering why I'm talking about this kind of aspect of religious freedom at all today. But for many of us, I want you to consider that religious freedom is not simply about our legal protections. It is more fundamentally about our ability to worship or to choose not to worship without fear of our basic physical safety. And at a time when there are some who might seek to narrowly define what religious freedom means, I think it's really important to root us in this fundamental idea, the right to worship without fear. And the rise of hate, particularly hate driven by white nationalists, is incredibly dangerous. It is the reason why President Biden even decided to run for president. The Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, during which Heather Heyer was killed, during which white nationalist protesters chanted, "Jews will not replace us." And as BJC often speaks and writes about, there's some dangerous overlap between those who are seeking to create an America that excludes those with minority religious affiliations and those who are seeking to exclude communities of color. These are not separate conversations, and the recent rise in anti-Semitism in this country is perhaps the most salient reminder of that. So we cannot talk about religious freedom in public schools without addressing hate and hate-motivated violence. I'm really proud that President Biden held a United We Stand summit in September to launch the White House initiative on hate-motivated violence to do just this work. This necessarily includes how hate and hate-motivated violence manifest in schools through bullying, harassment, and discrimination, and the importance of our efforts, the Department of Education, to prevent these incidents and also to address civil rights violations. The department had several action items coming out of that summit. To highlight just a couple, as a result of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the department awarded $1 billion in funds to help schools create safer and healthier learning environments. We also proposed guidance for states and school districts on how those funds can be used to support school and community partnerships to prevent and respond to acts of bullying, violence, and hate. We're also developing a call to action that will, among other things, provide expanded technical assistance to help schools access the many existing federal resources that can help them do this work. And as the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, we're uplifting some of these resources to specifically help prevent and address bullying against students based on their religious affiliations. I'm going to skip forward a little bit for the sake of time. The White House also announced an interagency policy committee on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and related forms of discrimination and bias. Our first order of business under this committee is to develop a national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. This is a high priority for this administration and one that we are very involved in at the Department of Education. By way of example, our Office for Civil Rights released guidance last month on how it receives complaints of discrimination against religious groups on the basis of shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics, to include incidents of anti-Semitism. And so that's kind of the freedom to worship without fear sort of section in a nutshell. There's a lot of work that is happening under that category. And to shift gears a little bit now, getting to the First Amendment, and I'm going to spend a smaller amount of time on this during my presentation because I know there's a lot more to kind of flesh out in the next presentation and in the Q&A. But getting to the First Amendment, specifically the free exercise and establishment clauses. I mean, this is absolutely one of the things I love most about this country. I think we truly got it right. As with many aspects of our founding, we often get it right more in principle than in practice, but that principle is something absolutely beautiful that we continue to strive toward each and every day. So we know that upholding this principle is not about merely tolerating each other, but about recognizing the inherent right of each individual to free exercise. That's why, for example, the Department of Education, we maintain guidance on constitutionally protected prayer and religious expression in public elementary and secondary schools. We require certifications every year from all state educational agencies that they and all of their local educational agencies are abiding by this guidance. Anyone who's been in a classroom right before an exam knows that prayer absolutely happens in public schools. Prayer and many other forms of religious expression, as well as atheistic or non-religious expressions, are constitutionally protected in public schools. At the department, we also remind folks that the separation of church and state is not about halting those privately initiated expressions, but allowing for them to exist without government interference. And that's what it means to forbid the establishment of religion in accordance with our Constitution. Melissa Rogers, the executive director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, put this rather eloquently just last month. So I'm going to read and do the thing that you don't do and read a quote from a PowerPoint slide. She said, at the time that our religious freedom guarantees were adopted, some felt it unwise. They said religion needed government support, but our historical experience has been the opposite. Religion thrives best when left to individuals and communities of faith. Not only does this nation have incredible religious diversity and vitality, we also have remarkable cooperation across faiths and beliefs. So that's why we're proud to have, among other things, issued a notice of proposed rulemaking last month across 9 agencies to restore religious freedom protections for beneficiaries of government services, including U.S. Department of Education grant programs, as well as job training, job search assistance, housing services, and more. And so there's a lot more to say, I think, on what we're doing in terms of free exercise and separation of church and state. But I want to make sure that I spend some time on this last category as well, that I want to talk about today in terms of our freedom of religion work, and that's religious literacy. So we're looking at not just what schools can do to uphold the basic rights of students of all faiths and none, but also what they can do to take it one step further and make sure students of all faiths and none can truly thrive as their full selves. And so I've been referring to this body of work as religious literacy. There may be other terms for it as well. But I'm essentially talking about 3 things. First, teaching about religion and respect for religious pluralism. I should note that curricula are not the domain of the Department of Education, but of state and local government. But there are other ways we talk about teaching respect for religious pluralism through how we set up our learning environments. How are we celebrating difference? How are we welcoming and acknowledging the religious diversity within our classrooms and within our communities? When some students are celebrating religious holidays, how are we recognizing that this is happening in our communities and cultivating respect for that? The second category, we think about our school policies and practices and how we're being truly inclusive in those. How are we structuring our learning environments to be fully inclusive across different characteristics, including across religious identity? So for example, academic calendars are generally structured around Western Christian holidays. Some school districts are adding additional holidays now to the calendar to reflect the religious diversity of their schools, or they're updating their accommodations policies. In addition, how are we thinking proactively about how we schedule things throughout the year to make sure no student has to, say, choose between a final exam and observing their sacred holiday with family and community? Another example, are there dress codes that are, at least on paper, overly restrictive of religious head coverings or other attire? Are we requiring gym uniforms that, we say need to be shorts, but there's no reason why it couldn't be pants, or there couldn't be the option for pants for those who feel a religious obligation to cover their legs? Does the school cafeteria provide dietary options that are inclusive of every student seeking a nutritious meal? And the last sort of category of work is, or dimension, I should say, to religious literacy is social emotional learning. This is something I'm still learning a lot myself about from experts. I understand, a core component of education. A lot of it is having skills to think about, as a student, who I am, how I show up in the world, how to be a leader, how to solve conflicts with peers, these kind of essential life skills. And we need to be able to bring our full selves into that process of identity formation and learning what it means to be human. And for students of faith, their religious identities will be a part of that. So how do we help students feel comfortable bringing their full identities into that learning process in a way that's privately initiated, that is including their religious and non-religious identity, if that's an essential part of how they see themselves, and that does so in a way that's respectful of all the students in the classroom? So we're working at the center to provide resources, guidance, including through our webinars for educators, for administrators, for families, so they have some tools to think through these questions for their own school communities. And again, not just about kind of the basic rights here, because I think, I want to challenge us to think even further and dream a little bit bigger, right? How do we make sure that we're not just protecting, but we're thinking, what does it really mean for all students to have freedom of religion and to be truly free to learn? And so I think it involves thinking through some of these questions as well. And just to kind of bring it all full circle, religious literacy is also critical to guarding against bullying and hate that is born of ignorance about religious difference. And when I talk to many faith and community leaders, it's so heartwarming to hear them say, not just, importantly, please help, protect our kids from bullying, but also please help us protect our kids from being bullies. Help us protect them from hate. And part of that equation is, of course, understanding who their peers are a bit better across lines of difference and welcoming that conversation in ways that are in alignment with our constitutional commitments. So with that, I think it's my job to turn it over to Reverend Dr. Brian Kaylor, and I look forward to the remainder of our time together. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. That was an exciting presentation, and I'll be adding in a little bit different direction as we think about the importance of religious liberty in dealing with public schools today. In some ways, what we just heard was a lot of the inspiring part. Think Star Wars: A New Hope, and my job is to offer a little bit more of The Empire Strikes Back. And so we're going to look at the ways that, unfortunately, public education is under attack today. And it's under attack by those espousing Christian nationalism. And so I think, as a Christian myself, and I know many of the people here are also Christians, and thankful that Christians Against Christian Nationalism is having this event, it's important for us to speak out about what's happening to undermine public education. I am a product of public education. I am a public education parent. I am a former professor at a public university. I believe in public education, and it is something that is foundational to our democracy, to the health of our communities, and it is important for all of our children, not whether you have children that are in the public schools or just the children in our community. And those that are most threatened by attacks on public schools are those that come from lower income families or those with less opportunities. And we have a responsibility as a community to speak out for the common good, for the goodwill of all. And that's what we need to be doing. But unfortunately, we're seeing that Christian nationalism is often targeting public schools. They want to undermine public education, and particularly the pluralism that is demanded in our society and our public schools. Now, I will acknowledge that this is not a new problem. We have seen threats and attacks on public education from white Christian nationalism. We saw this in the 1950s and 60s after Brown v. Board of Education, with the fight to stop efforts to integrate our public schools. You might not notice in one of the signs there on the larger picture, it says "Stop the Race Mixing March of the Antichrist." And so religious rhetoric was very much embedded in the attacks on public education system, particularly a public education that would be welcoming and open to all. And that's what has been under threat. And so we saw this rise of a lot of private Christian schools that were a way of a white flight out of the public school system. And a lot of the issues that we're dealing with today on topics of school choice and funding for private schools is a direct result of the residue of what happened in the 1950s and 1960s in reaction in this racism that we had then that continues today. And so a lot of these debates are still coming out from that era. But at the same time, what I want to focus on is the current attacks on the public education system. We've been seeing this particularly over the last several years, an effort that emerged called Project Blitz. It's a coalition effort of various groups espousing Christian nationalism, and they do this in a number of ways. Here's a couple of the stated purposes of the Project Blitz effort: to protect the free exercise of traditional Judeo-Christian religious values and beliefs in the public square, to properly frame the narrative and the language of religious liberty issues. And there's a lot of loaded language happening here. This is just kind of a polished, nice way of saying Christian nationalism. They want to create a system where Christians are considered a good American is to be a Christian, and that Christians received a privileged place, not just in government, not just in society, but in curriculum and in the school system. And this is something that we've particularly been seeing over the last several years. They create model legislation for lawmakers, state lawmakers, to literally just copy, paste, and file. So a lot of these bills look very similar because they don't even have to come up and write the bill themselves. And, I also think it's important to note that this is something that's focused on state level legislation. Washington, D.C. gets a lot of attention in the media, in politics, and understandably so. But a lot of the legislation that most impacts you on a day-to-day life is going to happen in your state house. And there's not nearly as much media attention, as politicking, as advocacy that's happening at the state level. And so a lot of times bills can go through that just don't get the level of attention that we might see with national legislation. Now, not all of this Project Blitz effort is focused on public education, but a lot of it is. It particularly accelerated in 2018, 2019. There was a spike of massive bills, slowed down a little bit with the beginning of COVID, as there were just a lot of legislative sessions were canceled. There were other priorities, but we're seeing some of the bills continuing to come forward as we come out of the pandemic. It's also sparked a lot of pushback from researchers like Frederick Clarkson. Groups like BJC have been instrumental in fighting back and pushing back against Project Blitz, to the point now that they actually don't even call themselves Project Blitz. The branding has become problematic, but it is still very much an initiative that is alive and well. So let me focus on a couple of the areas of this type of Christian nationalistic push that we're seeing that impact public education. One type of bill is what's called Bible literacy bills, and these are bills to encourage and to promote an elective social studies class to push the Bible in public schools. This has actually passed in several states, primarily in the South, over the last several years, and it's been proposed in more than half of the states across the country, and is continuing to pop up this year in a number of state legislative bodies. On the face, these bills often seem to be pretty innocuous, right? The bills will say, it's just the historical impact of the Bible, the literary impact of the Bible. And it is true, the Bible has a strong historical importance. It has had an influence on literature. But when you really pay attention to what they're saying about the bills, you recognize it's not really about history. It's not really about good literature. It is about teaching the Bible as a conservative Christian document to push a very particular narrow slice and view of Christianity. Sometimes they'll say this openly in the hearings. I've testified against a bill like this in Missouri. I've already done so this legislative session, so it's my 5th year in a row. And most years I've been 2 or 3 times in hearings to testify against this type of legislation. And sometimes they just very openly talk about, pastors will show up and testify for why the Bible should be taught in schools. And it is not about history, and it's not about literature. And sometimes even the lawmakers who promote these bills will go on, they'll say one thing in the legislative session, and then they'll go on Facebook and they'll put on memes about how they're fighting for the Word of God and they're fighting for the Bible. And so you recognize that they really do have a sectarian religious agenda here to undermine the pluralism of our public schools. And that's what's going on. Interestingly, there's actually a bill that's being drafted in Montana this year that goes even farther. And in the bill itself actually says the quiet part out loud. Here's a couple of the whereas statements in the beginning of this bill that hasn't moved yet at all. But whereas an elective course offering... Oh, here we go. Whereas today's youth need to have God's word integrated into their lives if they have any hope of surviving and flourishing in today's postmodern anti-Christian culture. And whereas an elective course offering the study of the Bible would provide students with the marvelous opportunity to study God's word and have it change their lives for eternity. This is in the actual drafting of the bill, that if lawmakers are to debate and vote on this, this is what they would actually be voting on and approving. And so it's very clear what the goal of the legislation here is. It's to say that this religion is preferred. And if you are of this faith, hey, we have a class that you can go and take, and other faith traditions are left out. Even in states where there are attempts to modify the bills to allow other religious texts, more like a comparative religion class, those amendments are generally voted down by the same lawmakers that will vote for this type of legislation. There's actually even, it was a bill last year in Oklahoma that wanted, Oklahoma's already passed this legislation, that wanted to go and then make it a requirement that you had to use the King James Version of the Bible as the text in these classes. That did not pass, but there's always this effort to continue to push farther and farther in the legislation. Another effort that we're seeing out of Project Blitz is bills to require the posting of "In God We Trust" in public schools. This has also already passed in over a dozen states, and new states are continuing. South Carolina just passed it last year, so it'll be going into effect later this summer to impact the schools next fall. Most of the states that have passed this require it. There's a couple of states like Texas and Ohio that didn't want to use the requirement of the funding, and so they only require the posting if someone donates it. So this is from a school board in Texas where the posters are being donated and by a conservative Christian phone company that's been very active in school boards and trying to take over school boards to put on conservative Christians in them. So they clearly have an agenda of reworking the public education system to make it more, quote, Christian. And that's a part of what we're seeing here. There's actually even some efforts to not just put it once in every school, but actually put it once in every classroom. Mississippi already has that. Louisiana has a bill this year to do that because they already have it in every school. And one of the sponsors said that he asked his grandkids and they hadn't noticed it. So now he wants to put it in every classroom. I joke that as a public education parent, my son is in 5th grade, that I'm not sure even if you put it in every classroom or on every student desk that the kids would necessarily read it. But again, we continue to see that once something is passed, there's this effort of continuing to push more and more. Another effort that we're seeing, I think, more this year and we'll continue to see because of a Supreme Court decision last year in Kennedy and Bremerton case is going to be on school prayer. That was a very, very quickly that BJC has done has a lot of good resources about that case. It is perhaps a frustrating and confusing case if you're involved in public school system, because I'm not sure what you're supposed to do with it. You have the facts of the matter, that this was a very public, coercive situation of prayer, and then you have the writings, the opinions of the majority opinion that said this prayer was allowed after the football game at a high school in Washington, that pretend like it's this private, personal, quiet prayer. And so I don't know if you're supposed to look at the words of the opinion or the facts of the matter. It was one of those unusual moments where there was a Supreme Court Justice, Sotomayor, actually even put pictures in her dissent, which is very unusual for an opinion, just to make the point, this is one of the pictures, that this is not a private prayer. This is not a private, quiet moment. You can see Coach Kennedy is clearly leading his team in a public prayer. And so as a result, we are seeing legislation that's trying to bring prayer back in schools. Again, as Maggie already noted, and I was going to make this joke, so she stole it. As long as there are math tests in school, there will be prayer. We don't have to worry about that. But this is about having prayer that is led, that can impact other people that are listening, those that don't necessarily even want to pray. This is a bill in Mississippi that actually even has a trigger clause. So this would say that if the Supreme Court decision that barred compulsory prayer in public schools, Ingle v. Vattel, if that was ever overturned by the Supreme Court, that then this bill, it's not a law yet, but this bill would then go into effect, had it been passed, to promote public school prayer. These trigger laws clauses should be kind of interest right now, because a number of states immediately banned abortion because they already had laws on the books that weren't enforced, but had trigger clauses that they would go into effect once Roe v. Wade was overturned. And so then the moment that happened last year, a number of states immediately already had abortion bans. And so we can see this push happening on school prayers. All of this type of legislation sends a dangerous message to our school children that if you're not a Christian, or if you're not even a narrow slice of conservative Christianity, that you're not necessarily a full American, you're not necessarily a full citizen, perhaps you're not even fully welcome in your own school. And that is a tragic and horrific message to send to our school children. And I think that that is highly problematic. And that's what all of these bills are attempting to do as they promote Christianity in the public schools. We're also seeing Christian nationalism in the last year or so fighting in other ways that aren't necessarily about the establishment of religion, but we're seeing this through efforts to ban books. This was a library in California put this up. These aren't books that they had actually banned, but these are books, a display of books that had been banned somewhere in the United States. And of course, they're encouraging people to read the banned books with this. But we're seeing this in public schools. We've seen school boards become rowdy events, like this one in Virginia, over fights over critical race theory, over transgender children, a lot of efforts to, again, take a very narrow slice of Christianity and then to establish these beliefs and to essentially to bar public schools from truly teaching actual American history, from truly helping and serving all of the children in their schools. And all of this is being done in the name of Christianity. And so we're seeing, again, these books are being banned, these efforts to limit what is being taught. This is an assault on public education. This is an attempt to stop schools from doing what they're actually intended and meant to do. And I think it's really important that we fight back, that we push back. There's a number of ways we can do this, and I'll wrap up so that we can have some time for questions, and I look forward to that. Churches, religious groups can adopt schools as a way of showing your support for a local school by volunteering to help mentor children, by just doing service projects at the school. Because let's face it, a lot of our schools don't have the funding and the budgets that they should have. And so a lot of churches across the country, houses of worship, are stepping in and providing funding to help pay for things that our taxpayer dollars should be doing, but it's not happening. So that's one way that you can support your local schools. This also helps teach those in your congregation the value of public education by getting them involved, by helping them learn about why does our congregation, why does our house of worship support our local school. Another way is to get involved in the local school board. Hopefully we won't be the ones with the rowdy images, but we can go there and to speak up and to stand up and to encourage our school board members, to encourage our teachers who are underpaid and generally underappreciated, to encourage them when they're being attacked, when they're being criticized merely for trying to educate our students and the next generation. And then I'd also encourage you, again, a lot of this has been focused in state legislatures. And so particularly if you live close to a state capitol, pay attention to the legislation, show up and get involved. I mean, I have found that a lot of times when I show up on these church state bills, I will be the only Christian that's testifying against some of these Christian nationalism bills. And the first couple of times I did that, it showed up, I saw the faces on the lawmakers. It surprised them. Why was I, as a Baptist minister, showing up to oppose the Bible in public schools? And that's when I realized that I had an important role to play in showing up to join with those that are testifying from atheism and Muslim and satanic congregations, and then showing up as a Baptist minister alongside of them. So I'd encourage you to find ways to get up, to show up, testify. It's more fun when you bring friends. So sometimes here's a group of 4 of us, Baptist ministers, that went and testified against the Bible and public school bill a few years ago. It can help make a difference. These are different ways that we can support public education because it is vital, it is foundational, and it is also under attack right now from Christian nationalism. So I will close there and look forward to continuing this important conversation.
Well, thanks so much, Brian. That was excellent. And thank you, Maggie. I think that having you all present back to back is really important because, Maggie, you reminded us that we have all the tools in our toolbox to support religious freedom for all, again, in this promise that's in our Constitution, these legal protections that we have. And then, Brian, your presentation was a very wide-eyed look at what the reality is in many places now with this current resurgent push that is attacking those foundational values of religious freedom for all. So we have had a number of questions, and for the most part, I'm going to direct they really are more directed to one or of you as opposed to the other. The first question I'm going to ask, though, is one place where I did note some similarity or some common themes in your presentations beyond the fantastic prayer in public schools reminder joke about there always will be prayer in public school. It's the government sponsored prayer that we are most worried about. And we are going to put in the chat features some resources at BJC to help make sense of religion in the public schools, including in light of the recent Supreme Court case. But you both talked about literacy. Maggie, you talked about religious literacy as one of the key components of Department of Education. Brian, you talked about some of these Bible literacy bills that are being pushed in state houses. And I should note that Dr. Mark Chauncey is one of the leading experts in the country on Bible literacy bills. He had originally been scheduled to present today and unfortunately was unable to. Brian, you did a fantastic job. But if you could both, I guess, speak to what's the difference, or however you take this, but can you help extrapolate the difference between religious literacy and Bible literacy? And Brian, specifically to you, when you answer the question, someone had asked the question, are there ever any amendments to these Bible literacy bills to include the Quran or other religious texts to remind people that we're not just here to teach about the Bible? And how do proponents of these bills, these Bible literacy bills, try to justify them as religion neutral? So Maggie, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to speak briefly and then just turn it over to Brian. But, really, when we're talking about religious literacy, we're talking about teaching about religion, not teaching religion, first of all, right? We believe that, religious education is something that happens outside of government institutions. And I think, I heard a pastor joke not long ago. I'm not sure that I want my child's teachers to be, the ones that didn't go to seminary to be providing religious education, even when they do share the same faith background. So I think there's there's the First Amendment element of that, and then there's also the sort of practical elements of it if you think a little bit more deeply there. I also want to just note that religious literacy, in addition to sort of having this, understanding of the religious diversity of our communities around us and cultivating this respect for religious pluralism, it's also, in terms of the definition that was adopted by the American Academy of Religion, it's really more about kind of like cultivating that skill set to understand that religious diversity rather than, say, having X, Y, and Z facts about religion. Having those kinds of that kind of knowledge can be really helpful too. It's really about making sure that students are able to really understand the world around them and understand the diversity in the communities around them and have the skills with which to do that work.
Yeah, I would just add that, so religious literacy is really important, and it's also currently allowed, right? Public educators have the right to teach. In fact, if you want to even teach like biblical literacy, like if you're teaching Shakespeare in an English class and there's an allusion or phrase that's taken from the Bible, the teacher has the freedom to mention that. So that's one of the ironies here is we actually don't need these, quote, Bible literacy bills to be able to teach biblical literacy today in public schools. That's already allowed. You could already teach a public religion or a comparative religion class in the public school. So all of that's already allowed. And that's what's really important here is that these bills are not actually about literacy. They are about promoting, they are about pushing one faith in a more religious sense and a more sectarian sense. And yes, I have seen on the question about amendments, I can't speak on all states, but I have seen efforts when there have been amendments made to include this other religious text or this, and then watch them get voted down because it isn't about religious literacy. Even in Missouri, for instance, they say it's about teaching the historical impact that the Bible had, that, no text had impacted history as much. And then if you really want to know Missouri history, you're going to have to talk about Mormonism. And so then they'll bring up an amendment to add the Book of Mormon to that, and it gets voted down, which shows this isn't about history. It's not about literacy. It's not about literature. It is about a sectarian view and indoctrinating our students.
Great, thanks so much. A question for you, Maggie, particular to the first part of your presentation when you were talking about freedom to worship without fear and some of the efforts to combat bullying and harassment in schools. First, does the Department of Education purview include preventing bullying and harassment not only against students, but also against teachers and staff? And second, does the Department of Education consider public-private partnerships to combat bullying, including working with social workers and the interdisciplinary use of chaplains?
Sure, thanks for those questions. So in terms of bullying against teachers, we understand this is a significant issue in some instances. And we recently held a webinar on preventing and addressing bullying on the basis of religion. And one of our participants drew special attention to this issue. It's from a Muslim community and noted data around kind of the high percentages of bullying being directed toward educators. I would just underscore the importance of professional development about identity-based bullying and about religious pluralism that would benefit both students and educators that might be on the receiving end of that. And so that's certainly something we're bringing into the conversation, when there are civil rights complaints, right, that occur in school settings. Our Office of Civil Rights, I'm sure, would want to know about those regardless of who's implicated in those. And I can provide the link to how to file a complaint if that's helpful in the chat. In terms of partnerships, those public-private partnerships you mentioned, we actually have multiple technical assistance centers that are external to the department, but that the department funds through grants each year. There are quite a few of them, but just to name a few: the National Center for Safe and Supportive Learning Environments, the Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, and then 4 regional equity assistance centers. I mentioned those because each of them has as a component of their work efforts to prevent bullying and create safe and supportive learning environments. And there are a number of experts, and I can't profess to know the full scope of all of their expertise, but that are affiliated with those centers. And so for example, on our last webinar for our religious literacy series, we had someone who works for the Anti-Defamation League, but is also on the advisory board of one of our equity assistance centers. And so that's how we got connected to her, because she has this particular expertise at the intersection of equity work in K through 12 public schools and religious literacy. We also featured someone from a county government who does faith outreach and works specifically with a faith advisory working group that the school district engages regularly to get that advice. So I'm not sure if they're chaplains or social workers or others kind of in that group, but trying to present models where schools and school districts can do that work directly to engage others in the community as well that have the specific expertise. We, to my knowledge, as a center, we don't have, any kinds of public-private partnerships right now at the federal level, but we are absolutely interested in seeing how we can better engage with folks like chaplains, kind of building off the legacy of President Obama's, I always get the name wrong, the Interfaith and Community Service Campus Challenge, so long the name, but just kind of building off of that legacy. There were so many chaplains, in the higher ed space and others who are really doing that work to think about interfaith relations in educational settings. And so, would absolutely be interested in if folks want to follow up with us, please do, and your ideas and how we can kind of facilitate more intentional partnerships with those groups.
Fantastic. And I think that's all just a really important reminder, is that no one is asked to shed their religious identity when they come into a public school, nor do we want that rich pluralism and religious diversity adds to our communities. And I think some of the best ways to combat some of the Christian nationalism that's being advanced is just to remind people about all of the protections for religious freedom and religious expression that we do have in our public schools. And I know that in the chat, we've included some of those resources that BJC offers that we have found have been particularly effective in sharing with your neighbors to, I think, correct some misinformation that's out there about the real status of religious expression in public schools. So Brian, I'm really pleased that you highlighted your legislative experience of advocacy at the end of the presentation. And we had some kind of very practical questions. And I think that's important when we're doing this. We're always not just trying to identify problems, we're trying to help find solutions and to empower and enable people to be advocates themselves in their communities. And so one of the questions was, how do we discuss this problem, particularly when those who are most furthering Christian nationalism are picking and choosing history and biblical phrases out of context to support the ideology? This person says, I am a Christian who opposes Christian nationalism, which is wonderful. But, what are some of the techniques and how you have brought your faith-based identity into the public square when you're testifying that you've found helpful?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I alluded to the fact that I think it's important for those who are Christians to show up at these hearings, because otherwise it can very easily just become a religion and church people versus everyone else. And so most of the times that I've shown up, I'll be the only Christian on the opposition side, and there'll be several pastors and denominational individuals on the other side. And I see the way the lawmakers treat me as a minister compared to the way they treat an atheist or a Satanist or a Muslim, right? They take it differently. So I lean into the religious identity in explaining why I believe the Bible, why I believe in religious liberty, and why I don't want this bill. And I think that that's really important. And on that practical side, I've seen a couple of questions asking about, how do we find these bills? And unfortunately, there's not like a great tracker out there. I mean, there's some groups that have some legislation tracking. Americans United has some, American Atheists have some. Blitzwatch is another site by Frederick Clarkson and some others that I don't think has been updated as much this legislative session. So it can be kind of hard to find them. But the best thing you can do is just go to your state house and your state Senate websites. You can usually find like a word search for bills. And sometimes you'll have to do both of them separately. And, type in words like Bible. Sometimes on the biblical literacy, you might type in like Hebrew, but that's when you'll get the Hebrew scripture and New Testament language will pop in. God or motto, we'll find the In God We Trust bills. Religion, religious. This is how I find the ones in Missouri. I type in all those words and just wait for the bills to pop up. And then depending on the state, sometimes you will be able to go and testify. That's not true in all states. But you can always contact your own state representative, your own state senator, and you can also contact every person on a committee right before they have a hearing. So if you live too far from a state capitol and you can't make it, you can send them an email that says, hey, this is who I am, and this is why I'm opposed to it. But I would encourage people to lean into your religious identity to explain why we still believe in religious liberty, why we believe in pluralism, why we believe in church-state separation, and how that is good both for religion and for state.
Fantastic. I wholeheartedly agree. It is, I think, a byproduct of Christian nationalism that those of us who are Christians, particularly those of us who are white Christians, do enjoy a lot of relative privilege in these spaces. And so it is, I think, as I've said publicly a number of times, I think we bear a special responsibility in being active in opposing Christian nationalism and to bring our faith-based selves into those public policy spaces when we do that. Brian, this is a question that is actually not related directly to some of the things that you presented, but a question about, I will remind everyone, if you did not already know, that next week is Public Schools Week. It is a time when we as a country celebrate all of the contributions of public schools. I believe that more than 90% of American children still attend public schools. Maggie could probably tell us the, but it's a very large percentage of American children who are in public schools. And one question has been raised about relationship between Christian nationalism and the larger school choice movement, or efforts to privatize education. And I wonder if that's something that you could speak to at all, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that not all school choice advocates and not everyone who wants funding for private schools espouses Christian nationalism or is even Christian. However, Christian nationalism is helping to fuel that effort. It is an effort, and again, as I noted at the very beginning of my presentation, some of it's because of schools that were founded as white Christian schools to avoid integration. And those schools are still functioning, even if they have started to integrate themselves. They are birthed out of that effort. And that's what's pushing a lot of the school choice legislation. It's important to note what that's school choice is problematic because it's not that you get to choose your school, it's that the school gets to choose you. I mean, let's just be really clear about what's happening here. The public schools are the only schools that are required to accept any and all students. So the problem with, vouchers or any of these types of programs is that a lot of this legislation is going to provide government funding for private schools that then still have a right, and they're suing and fighting for this right to discriminate against who they accept as students. And so that's really problematic, that we would be taking money, taxpayer money, out of the public school system to give the schools that won't actually even serve all of the students. And so then if we take enough money and enough students out of the schools, we're left with those that don't have necessarily the income and the support. And then when there's that next tax initiative, right, to the bond issue to raise money for your public school, and you have all these people that don't have kids in public schools, so they vote against it. And then eventually our public schools continue to fall apart, and those that are unaccepted by the elite schools are left behind ultimately. And so, this is a really problematic school choice, school vouchers, all of this. It is an assault on the public school system.
Thank you so much. And we'd encourage those on this call to celebrate Public Schools Week next week and to share some resources. I know we at BJC will be sharing some resources on this topic as well. Maggie, in the vein of kind of what we can do as a community, I think you really laid out well all of the ways that our laws and policies are designed to support religious diversity in public schools. How can people in their communities assure that students of all faith traditions feel valued in our public schools?
There's a lot that you can do. Schools, I think, really rely on families and communities to kind of help inform their decision making, right? There are often various types of listening sessions, and from the school district level on down to the school, on how funds are allocated and how decisions are made, and what it looks like to really support students. And schools are doing incredible work. I think oftentimes we dwell on what's not going well, but I think, it's important to remind ourselves also that for many of our students, schools are the places where they are thriving, where they feel safe, where they feel supported, and, helping make sure that they continue to be that way. And so, I think wherever you can, reminding school communities that students are of all faiths and none, that we value individual religious expression, that even down to the level of two students that have the same faith tradition may have widely divergent ideas about what that means to them. So just really reminding folks about what it means to kind of create space for all students in the classroom, thinking about those practices and policies that I mentioned earlier around academic calendar, around dress code. I heard an example about holiday concerts where your school might be used to having the same 5 songs every year, right? How do you think about, is this an opportunity to reflect the religious and cultural diversity, in the school community, right? So kind of rethinking those things and pushing, whether that's as a parent or a community member, really encouraging folks to think about, what does it look like to have that kind of religiously literate environment, and then of course, making sure that those First Amendment protections are there, that students feel safe, and that they are free to learn in their school environments. So yeah, there's a lot you can do. There's no end to what you can do, and I'm grateful that everybody's here on this webinar to learn how to do that work. And thank you for your commitment to this.
Well, thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Brian. We're getting close to the time. One of the comments or questions was, I wish we could applaud. So just know that the attendees here have really, I think, as have I, benefited from both of your presentations. And I think that that what I'm hearing from you both is that there is a lot that we can do as community advocates to support our public schools, to support our public school kids and teachers and staff and school boards and administrations who are charged with educating all of our children, regardless on where they worship, how they worship, what they believe, or how they identify religiously. That sense of belonging is core to what it means to be an American, and we can be patriotic in our public schools and in our communities, and support and advance religious freedom for all. So thank you both for being here. Thank you to this wonderful audience who has joined us here. Hundreds of people joined us here live today, which is fantastic. And we have recorded this webinar. We will be sharing the link, and we encourage you to share it with others as a way to celebrate Public Schools Week next week, and to stay involved with Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and to join us next month for our trainings on how to write an op-ed. Perhaps you'll want to write an op-ed about this very issue in your local paper and website. So thank you both, and we'll say goodbye now.